2 hours after I gave birth, I asked my husband to hold our daughter. He didn't move. He stood there in his tailored grey coat, staring down at her like she was a stranger's mistake left on his doorstep. Then he leaned in close enough that only I could hear him, and he said the words that would end our marriage before sunrise. I already have a son with another woman. I'm not putting my name on this baby. I didn't cry. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I looked down at my daughter's face, still soft and pink and completely unaware that her father had just chosen someone else in the same breath he refused her. I pulled her closer against my chest, and I smiled. Then remember this moment, I whispered, because it's the last one you'll ever get from us. He laughed. He actually laughed, like I'd said something cute a tired new mother blurts out before she comes to her senses. He had no idea that by the next morning we'd be gone, and that his regret was only just beginning. My name is Sable Reed, and this is the story of the night my husband threw away his family, his fortune, and his future, all in the 2 hours after I became a mother. But to understand how we got to that hospital room, you have to go back 4 years, to the day a man named Weston Calloway walked into my life the way expensive things always do, quietly, and then all at once. I was a contracts auditor in Charlotte, the kind of job where you read fine print until your eyes ache. Weston was heir to Calloway Holdings, a real estate empire his grandfather had built from a single roadside motel. He never raised his voice. Never checked his phone at dinner. Never once made me feel like an afterthought in a life that was already full before I arrived. For the first year, I thought I'd found the rarest thing in the world, a wealthy man who still remembered how to be kind to a woman who couldn't do a single thing for him. His mother, Adele, was polite to me the way people are polite to something they're waiting to replace. His father, Preston, barely spoke to me at all, always finding a reason to leave the room within minutes of my arrival. I told myself that was just old money, old manners. I didn't understand yet that in that family, silence was never neutral. It was a decision, made carefully, and revisited only when it stopped being useful. We married 18 months after we met. In a small ceremony Weston insisted on keeping quiet. Away from the company noise, he said, squeezing my hand like the two of us were conspiring against something bigger than ourselves. I remember straightening his tie in the courthouse hallway, his hand shaking, and thinking a man that nervous about marrying me couldn't possibly be capable of the kind of calm, practiced cruelty I'd meet 2 years later in a hospital room. I was wrong. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. Mostly because he was very good at saying them like they were simple truths instead of careful scripts. It was our second year of marriage when I first heard the name Camille Rousseau. Weston's executive assistant. Sharp blazers, a voice that never rose. I met her twice, the second time at a holiday dinner, where I caught her watching Weston across the room with an expression I couldn't place. Not quite guilt. Not quite longing. Something closer to exhaustion. I told myself I'd imagined it. Looking back, the small things had already started. Calls taken in the driveway instead of the house. Business trips extended by a day, then 2, with explanations that were technically plausible and somehow never specific. And whenever I brought up the idea of a bigger family, he'd go quiet in a way that felt less like a man dreaming ahead, and more like a man calculating how much longer he could avoid the subject. One night that same year, he came home past midnight from what he called a client dinner. The next morning I found a receipt in his coat pocket, a restaurant 2 towns over, time-stamped 2 hours earlier than when he said he'd left. I asked him about it, half joking. I watched him build an explanation in real time. A colleague's retirement dinner. A table he joined late. Nothing worth remembering. I remember thinking, even then, that a man telling the truth doesn't usually need 3 sentences to explain one dinner. I let it go anyway, because letting things go was easier than becoming the kind of wife who kept a list. That same holiday party, I ended up beside Camille near the drink table. She asked, carefully, how the nursery planning was going, since I'd mentioned trying for a baby at the office party the year before. It was an ordinary question, except for how carefully she asked it, like she was stepping around something she didn't want to disturb. She excused herself before I'd even finished answering. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 years. Before Camille's name ever crossed my mind, there were 2 years of fertility appointments neither of us discussed with anyone outside that clinic waiting room. Weston came to every one that first year. held my hand through 2 procedures that didn't take. Told me, more than once, that we had time. Looking back now, I wonder how much of that patience was real and how much was simply easier to perform than the alternative, a conversation about whether he was even still trying, in every sense of that word, with me at all. I'll never know exactly when his attention started splitting in 2 directions. I only know that somewhere in that second year, while I was tracking ovulation calendars and crying quietly in parking lots, another version of the answer he claimed to be waiting for was already underway, somewhere else entirely. When I finally got pregnant in the spring of our 3rd year, Weston cried at the ultrasound. He painted the nursery himself, over a single weekend. We picked a name together, a name we agreed on the week before I gave birth, Marlo. I didn't know then that Camille was already several months into a pregnancy of her own. I may never know exactly when it began. I only know it had been going on long enough, and carefully enough, that I never once caught it in 4 years of paying attention to almost everything else. What I didn't learn until much later was that Preston had known about the affair, and the pregnancy, for months. He'd given Weston an ultimatum: resolve it, one way or another, before the company's year-end board review, or Preston would raise it himself, in front of the people whose opinion of Weston mattered more to him than mine ever had. That review had already been moved up once. It was now scheduled for the week after my due date. Weston hadn't told me any of it. He'd simply started running out of time to keep 2 lives from touching. The morning I went into labor, Weston was pacing the triage room before I'd even finished checking in. Nervous energy I mistook, at the time, for excitement instead of guilt. He held my hand through 11 hours of labor. Fed me ice chips. Told the nurses, twice, unprompted, how excited he was to finally be a father. Looking back, I think some part of him meant it in the moment. The way an actor can mean a line while he's saying it, and still walk off stage into a completely different life 5 minutes later. Marlo was born at 6:47 in the morning, a Tuesday. She cried, and the sound filled the room in a way I still can't describe, except to say it felt like the beginning of something enormous. I held her against my chest, trembling, and looked up at Weston, waiting for him to reach for her the way he'd promised he would for 9 months. He didn't reach for her. He stepped back toward the window. "Do you want to hold her?" I asked gently. I told myself he was just in shock. "No," he said. And something in his voice had already gone flat and careful, in a way I'd never heard before. He stepped into the hallway a few minutes later. Through the half-open door, I heard fragments of a call he clearly thought I couldn't hear. A woman's voice, tight and insistent, and Weston, low, "Not like this. Not over the phone." Then he hung up and stood there, hand still on the doorframe, for a long moment. What I didn't know yet was that Camille had called him twice that morning. The second time to say she wasn't willing to stay hidden through another milestone. She wanted their son acknowledged publicly before the board review, not managed quietly around it. And 20 minutes earlier, a text had come in from Adele, letting him know she and Preston were already on their way to the hospital, with no intention of pretending, once they arrived, that there was only one grandchild worth acknowledging that year. Weston had maybe an hour before his own parents walked into that room and decided, on their terms, exactly how this would unfold in front of me. He came back in wearing a fresh suit. I understand now. He wasn't dressing for a conversation he wanted to have. He was dressing for one he'd finally run out of ways to avoid. 2 hours later, once the nurses had cleared out and the room had gone quiet, he came back in like he'd just stepped out to change into something appropriate for what he was about to say. He told me about Camille. About a son, named after his grandfather, born 4 months earlier. His parents had already met that baby, and were, though he didn't say it outright, minutes from walking through my door. "My family needs a male heir," he said, like he was reading from someone else's memo. "Camille gave them one. I won't acknowledge your daughter as a Calloway." I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. I looked at my daughter's sleeping face and something in me went still and sharp at the exact same time, like a door closing somewhere far away. "You're choosing them," I said. "Not a question." "I'm choosing my family's future," he said, like the 2 of us weren't standing in the middle of it. I smiled. It surprised him. I saw it shift something in his jaw. "Then remember this moment," I told him, "because it's the last one you're going to get from us." He laughed, and walked out to take a phone call, already halfway back to whatever life he thought was waiting for him at the other end of that hallway. Here's the thing nobody in that family understood yet. Not Weston, not Preston, not even me, fully, in that moment. I was about to spend the next 2 weeks doing something none of them saw coming. And it started with a phone call I'd almost let go to voicemail for the 3rd week in a row. I stayed in that hospital 2 more nights, the standard recovery window. I let myself have those 2 nights because I didn't trust my own legs yet, let alone my judgment. Weston didn't come back. My sister, Odette, drove 4 hours from Savannah the moment I called her, arriving before sunrise, still in yesterday's clothes. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked what I needed, in that order, and then simply took over. Holding Marlowe so I could sleep in real stretches. Arguing gently with a nurse about my pain medication. Sitting in the corner chair through visiting hours like she intended to outlast anyone who tried to make me leave before I was ready. She'd told me once, quietly, at my own wedding, that Weston had the kind of politeness that only shows up when someone's watching. I'd laughed it off then. I wasn't laughing now, finally understanding what she'd meant, for years too late. It was on that second night that I finally returned a call I'd been dodging for 3 weeks, from my late Uncle Elliot's estate attorney, a woman named Josephine Nader. Elliot had died 8 months earlier, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years designing buildings other men got credit for. I'd assumed it was routine paperwork. I was wrong. Josephine told me later she hadn't called 3 weeks straight over something routine. A year before he died, Elliot had come to her office, unprompted, and asked her to review an old partnership agreement. One that had since been folded into Callaway Holdings when the company expanded. He wanted to make sure the paperwork still meant what it used to mean. What she found concerned her enough to keep calling. A voting agreement, still active, still binding, tied to Elliot's 11% stake in the company's development arm. He'd never fully explained why he wanted it reviewed, only that he trusted her to understand it eventually, even if he wasn't around to explain it himself. It means, she told me, from that hospital bed, you have more say in that company than your husband thinks you do. I didn't rush into anything. I went home first, to the house Weston and I had shared for exactly 1 week, because I needed somewhere familiar to figure out what came next, and because no lawyer with any sense tells a woman 3 days postpartum to make permanent decisions on the spot. Weston didn't come home either. He stayed at his parents' house. The only contact I had that week was a single text asking whether I'd had time to think things over, as if I were the one who needed to reconsider a decision he'd made months before I ever went into labor. He called once, the 4th night. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, he didn't ask about Marlowe. He asked whether I'd spoken to anyone at the company, in a tone that told me he already suspected I had. I told him the truth, that I hadn't decided anything yet, which was accurate, even if it wasn't the whole picture. He said, almost gently, that he hoped we could keep this civil, as if civility were something he'd only just remembered existed now that losing it might cost him something. I hung up and sat with the phone in my lap for a long time, listening to Marlowe breathe in the bassinet, trying to figure out which version of him had ever actually been real. On the 5th night, I opened the closet and started packing quietly, 1 drawer at a time, not out of anger, but because staying had stopped making sense the moment I let myself admit it. By the end of that week, Odette had helped me move 2 streets from her own house, close enough that she could show up unannounced with groceries and an opinion about everything. And Josephine and I sat down properly, in daylight, with real coffee and enough time to ask real questions. What Elliot's shares gave me wasn't control of the company. It was the legal right to request a formal review of executive conduct that could expose Callaway Holdings to reputational or financial risk during any active financing period, and the company happened to be mid-refinancing that exact quarter. An affair that produced 2 competing children, one born to an employee, during a stretch when Weston had personally signed statements to lenders describing his stable personal circumstances, was exactly the kind of conduct that review existed to catch. I filed the request through Josephine at the start of the 2nd week. And this is the part one want you to sit with for a second, because it still gets me every time I tell it. I never once had to raise my voice, threaten him, or beg anyone to take me seriously. I let the company's own rules do something I never could have done from a hospital bed. force Weston to explain himself to people who had never needed my permission to ask hard questions. 2 weeks after I filed, before the board convened, Camille called me. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she told me she'd heard about the review and wanted to say something before it became a spectacle. She sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with a newborn, a tired I recognized, because I'd carried a version of it myself for 4 years without a name for it. She told me she'd grown up an only child outside Baton Rouge, moved to Charlotte for the job with no family nearby, and that somewhere in the loneliness of that first year, Weston's careful attention had started to feel like something it wasn't. She'd told herself she'd stop answering his calls after hours, and never quite managed it, until stopping would have meant losing the only steady thing in a city where she still didn't know anyone else well enough to call at midnight. Weston had promised her, months in, that he intended to leave me eventually. By the time she let herself believe him, she was already pregnant, isolated, unsure who else she could tell. He does this, she said quietly. He tells people exactly enough to keep them moving in his direction. Why are you telling me now? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Because someone should know the truth going in, she finally said, instead of finding out piece by piece in front of an audience. I thought about the nursery he painted, the ultrasound he cried at. And I understood, in that moment, that Camille and I had each been handed a version of the exact same performance, staged for 2 different women who both thought they were the only audience. The board meeting happened on a Thursday, in a glass room on the 14th floor that smelled like fresh coffee and something colder underneath. I wasn't required to attend in person. Josephine handled the procedural side. I went anyway, Marlo asleep in a carrier against my chest, because I wanted Weston to see exactly who was sitting across the table from him when his father finally made him explain himself out loud. Preston asked Weston, in front of 6 board members and 2 outside counsel, whether it was true he'd fathered a child with an employee while personally certifying to lenders that his circumstances were stable. Weston said the situation was being handled privately. Preston asked whether privately included leaving his newborn daughter in a hospital room in front of nursing staff who'd remember every detail of it. Weston didn't have an answer for that one. For the first time in 4 years, he looked like a man who'd run out of the right sentence to say. And then it got worse for him. A former colleague of Weston's, a man who'd left the company 2 months earlier on bad terms after a bonus dispute, sent Josephine a message thread he'd been sitting on out of simple resentment. In it, Weston joked, months earlier, that once the situation was settled, he planned to quietly separate from Camille within a year, once the optics no longer mattered. It wasn't luck that handed us that thread. It was the ordinary, predictable consequence of treating people as disposable and assuming none of them would ever compare notes. Camille sat through the reading with her hands flat on the table. When it finished, she stood, straightened her blazer, and said the only sentence I ever heard her speak to Weston directly. You should have just told the truth to somebody. Anybody. Even once. Before it cost this much. Then she walked out. Weston caught me in the elevator afterward, before I could reach the parking garage. He looked smaller in that mirrored box than I'd seen him look in 4 years of marriage, his jaw working like he was hunting for a version of himself that could still talk his way out of a room. You planned this, he said. Not quite a question, like he needed it to be my fault instead of his own. I didn't have to plan anything, I told him. I just stopped covering for you the second you stopped pretending. The doors opened before he could answer. I walked into the parking garage with my daughter asleep against my chest, and I didn't look back to see whether he followed. What came next wasn't a clean legal victory handed to me on a silver platter. I want to be honest about that. The trust language Elliot's generation had written decades earlier required any heir to be born within an intact marriage to hold inheritance priority, and that language created exactly what Josephine called it from day one. A genuine dispute, not an automatic answer. There were depositions. Financial disclosures. An outside mediator brought in to keep things out of a courtroom the family wanted to avoid at almost any cost. More than one afternoon where Josephine warned me it could still go either way. It took 4 months, running alongside the divorce proceedings, before the board's outside counsel finally settled it through negotiation. Marlo would hold formal inheritance standing as the only child born inside the marriage on record. Camille's son would remain outside the company's succession structure entirely, a separate matter for Weston to resolve on his own, if he chose to. Without the company's backing, Weston hadn't secured an heir. He'd spent a year manufacturing a dispute that ended with the daughter he refused to hold becoming the only child anyone in that family was legally required to provide for. The divorce settlement took those same 4 months. I didn't ask for anything vindictive in the paperwork. I asked for what was fair, and with Elliot's shares behind me, and a board that no longer trusted Weston with much of anything, fair turned out to be more than either of us expected going in. Custody was the one place Weston initially showed up looking like the man I'd married. He asked for structured visitation, and I let the mediator set reasonable terms, because I wanted to be able to tell Marlo honestly, someday, that I hadn't been the one who closed every door. He used 4 of his first 6 scheduled visits, showing up late to 2, cutting a third short for a work call. By her first birthday, he'd stopped scheduling them at all. No clause, no mediator, no amount of money ever fixed the part of him that made that choice 2 hours after she was born. Preston reached out himself, almost a year after the board meeting, and asked if we could talk without lawyers in the room. We met at a coffee shop near my new house, Neutral Ground. He looked older than I remembered, his hands wrapped around a cup he never drank from. He told me, in a conversation longer than any we'd had during my entire marriage, that his own father had run their family the same way, measuring people by usefulness instead of character, keeping score instead of keeping close. He said he hadn't realized how completely he'd repeated it with his own son, until he watched Weston walk out of a hospital room instead of toward his daughter, and recognized the exact shape of his own coldness looking back at him. It wasn't an apology, not in so many words. It was closer to an explanation, offered far too late, for a silence he finally understood he'd helped build long before I ever arrived in that family. Adele sent one letter that same year, on the same cream stationery she'd used for our wedding invitations, saying she hoped I'd understand these things are complicated. I read it twice and didn't answer. Some understanding isn't owed just because someone finally decides to ask for it after the damage is already done. I moved 2 hours away, to a quiet house with a yard and a maple tree Marlo insists on naming every season. Odette drives up most Sundays, still smelling faintly of whatever her husband was repairing that week, and she still hasn't let me live down the fact that she distrusted Weston's politeness years before I was ready to hear it. Josephine handles the trust paperwork twice a year now, always over coffee, always with the same dry joke about how 3 weeks of unanswered voicemails turned into the most useful legal strategy she never planned to hand me. Preston sends a card on Marlo's birthday now, signed simply Grandfather. Last year he asked, through Josephine, whether he could visit occasionally, no expectations attached. I said yes, mostly because Marlo deserves to decide for herself, someday, what kind of relationship she wants with a family whose name she carries, and whose fortune, as it turned out, became legally hers before her father ever fully understood what he'd lost. Weston called me once, almost a year after everything, late at night. His voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, none of the calm authority left in it at all. He asked if there was still a way to be part of Marlo's life, the way he should have been from the beginning, before any of this had a chance to happen. I thought about the hospital room. The 2 hours he made me sit there, believing he might still choose us before he decided not to. You had your 2 hours, I told him. I gave you the rest of your life after that to change your mind, and you spent every bit of it making sure you didn't. I hung up. I haven't heard from him since. Not a card. Not a message. Not even through Josephine. Marlo is walking now, fast, and a little reckless, the way toddlers are when they've decided the whole world exists specifically for them to explore. She has my mouth and somebody else's stubborn chin, and she started asking, in the fragmented way 2-year-olds ask anything, where her father is. I haven't found the right words yet. I don't think there's a version of the truth that fits neatly into a toddler's vocabulary. So for now, I tell her he's far away, and I let that be enough, knowing there's a harder conversation waiting for us both, somewhere down the road. One I refuse to have before she's actually ready to hear it. I think about that hospital room more than I probably should, given how far away it feels now. Not the cruelty of it. Not even the 2 hours themselves. But the exact moment right before I smiled, the half second where I could have chosen to fall apart instead. Something in me, quieter than anger and steadier than grief, decided not to. I don't know exactly where that steadiness came from. Maybe it was Elliot, waiting patiently in old paperwork for a moment he never got to see. Maybe it was Odette, sitting beside that bed instead of the man who should have been there. Maybe it was just what happens when a person finally runs out of reasons to make herself smaller for someone who was never going to notice the effort anyway. Every night, before she falls asleep, I tell Marlo the same thing, that the people who are supposed to choose you sometimes don't, and that isn't the end of the story, it's just the part where you find out who does. Some nights she's already asleep before I finish saying it. I say it anyway, quietly, mostly for myself at this point, because it's still the truest thing I know how to tell either of us. Sometimes winning isn't getting revenge. Sometimes it's just making sure the next generation never has to beg to be chosen. So let me ask you the same thing I still ask myself. If you were me, lying in that hospital bed with a promise breaking apart right in front of you, would you have smiled the way I did, or would you have let him see exactly what you were feeling in that moment? Tell me in the comments, because I still think about which one of us actually walked away having won.